Part 1. The Michel Thomas Method, the Master Teacher's Model. Michel Thomas was unquestionably one of the world's greatest educators. He was the leading expert in this field, who made amazing breakthroughs in learning. His methodology undeniably lays a solid and proven foundation for the future of learning. That is why we refer to Michel as the Master Teacher. Michel was truly a learning wizard on so many levels, who created his own teaching method. How was this possible? How did he achieve such unbelievable success in teaching? 80th critics and skeptics alike have said that what Michel did was unique to him and that it couldn't be replicated. They are wrong, very wrong. In this chapter we will explain the magic behind the Michel Thomas Method. Michel spent his life probing the learning process of the human mind, and he discovered many things about this process which allow people to learn at a rate previously considered impossible. And even more incredibly, he accomplished this without using traditional methods. Furthermore, the Master Teacher did it in a way that was effective. We will see how the Master Teacher had streamlined and accelerated the learning process. We will explore how he used his ingenious mind, the great lessons learned from his own life as well as his personal wisdom, to create tools of wonder to magically transform the learning process into a truly exciting and pleasurable experience. Michel managed to shatter many existing beliefs that have been linked to the traditional learning process for centuries. We shall trace, step by step, what Michel did when he taught his courses. We will also give many explanations of why what Michel did work so well. And, most important of all, we shall show how Michel's method provides a powerful and effective blueprint for others to follow. What is a method? First, it would be helpful to understand what we mean by a method. What exactly is a method? It is a way of doing something in accordance to a definite plan. An educational method is a way of teaching and learning that occurs according to a deliberate and systematic plan. It does not happen by accident or by chance. Rather, a method is a planned, orderly, logical, systematic and deliberate way of proceeding. Michel clearly explained this as follows. My method has been designed to teach rule govern syntactical, morphological and phonological constructs of the language, using examples and illustrations, as the grammar and the rules are being learned. Michel's method teaches the mechanics and tools of the language, and how to use them with a continuous process of student response and feedback. And most critical of all, as we will see, Michel's method places the responsibility for learning and for remembering on the teacher, not on the student. Michel's methods contrast with the methods used in most language programs, which are often too lengthy and rarely achieve expected results. These other language programs are based on grammar exercises, tedious memorizing, on fragmentary and ineffectual conversations, and use tools such as textbooks, drills and reading exercises, which require more time than any busy person can afford to take. Most important of all, these other language programs differ from Michel's method, in that they are totally reliant on a student's individual ability to learn, and contrary to Michel's method, these programs place the responsibility for learning totally on the student. The Master Teacher carefully worked out and refined his method of language teaching and learning over years of trial and error. His language teaching method included both what he taught the content of the language including the grammar and vocabulary and how he taught the process. Although Michel developed his method specifically to teach foreign languages, it can be applied to teaching any subject matter. It is a general method of teaching and learning, and is not just specifically applicable to teaching languages. What is really exciting is that Michel's method can be applied to other subject areas to produce equally amazing results. For purposes of analysis and as a brief, initial overview, we shall see that Michel's method of teaching and learning languages can be broken into several elements. 1. The learning environment. 2. The content. 3. The delivery of the material. The first element begins with the learning environment and the initial frames that Michel would lay out at the start of his course. The next part deals with the content of the learning sessions. This involves breaking the material to be covered into particular units or chunks and then sequencing these units in an appropriate fashion. The last element has to do with the actual delivery of the material. Before we get into the actual details of the method, however, let us look at the bigger picture of what Michel accomplished in his teaching. Below is an overview of some of the more important elements of Michel's method. We will elaborate on all of these elements and on others, as well in this chapter. We must emphasize that the method includes all of the elements organized in a particular way. Critics have often tried to simplify what Michel did. For example, they take one small element out of context, and then say that it is the key to the method. They make absurd statements, which base Michel's method on his use of cognates or on his use of helping verbs. This demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of the process. Explanations like these always annoy Michel, because no one element on its own is the method. All elements are necessary. In the past people tried to copy some of what Michel did, and then wondered why it wouldn't work. The answer is simple. All of the elements together have a synergistic effect. All are vital parts of the whole and none can be left out. Overview, structure of course content. In all of Michel's language courses 3 things occurred. First, the learner was taught the structure of the language. In his complete courses, the Master Teacher taught the entire structure grammar of the language and all of the tenses including the subjunctive. Michel called the tenses the tools of the language, and he taught how to use them correctly. He referred to grammar as the structure or mechanics of the language. He explained the process metaphorically as follows. You learn the strokes of how to swim. Once you learn the structure, it becomes self-sufficient. Michel strongly emphasized that any further instruction would only undo what was previously learned. Second, the learner was taught a complete, practical and functional vocabulary. In his audio courses, Michel provided sufficient vocabulary to enable the learner to begin to converse in the language. The students were encouraged to spend 10 minutes a day reading the newspaper, magazines or interviews of interest to them. Continuing this process daily was very important in itself, because it would build up vocabulary. The student would notice words that tend to reoccur and would then learn them. It is interesting to note that although the grammar presented in the introductory audio course is limited, even with the limitation, Michel explained further, it is still enough for you to swim in the language. I wouldn't recommend for you to jump into the deep ocean, which you can do after my complete course. With the initial audio course you will be comfortable swimming in a deep pool or lake. As we have said, Michel would teach the students how to swim, how deeply they plunge, and how fast they do so is up to them. After the 5-day course, there was no need for further instruction. The student learned how to swim and then he or she would swim. To use Michel's metaphor, the style and speed of swimming come from practice. Third, the learner was given the confidence, which came from swimming in the language, to use the language in actual conversations. During the entire learning process, Michel would continue to reassure his students of their progress, which, in turn, boosted their self-esteem as well. Moreover, his students ended up carrying their confidence with them into other contexts of their personal and professional lives. Michel may have been arguably the best confidence builder around. No matter whether it was in the context of personalized one-on-one teaching or with his tapes, Michel's focus would always be on developing the practical understanding necessary to actually use the language correctly. He would teach correct grammar and a practical and functional vocabulary. He accomplished this without using grammatical terms other than noun and verb and adjective and without memorizing grammatical rules. Correct grammar was taught in the context of learning to speak the language correctly. It was not enough for Michel that his students just be understood in the language. Michel was a perfectionist for structure and insisted on correct grammar. We will discuss this concept further on in this chapter. Michel would constantly remind us of the following truth: what one knows based on understanding, one will never forget. And in Michelle's eyes, their goal of education should be to create understanding, which in turn leads to the acquisition of know-edge. So how does one develop understanding and know-edge of the language? Michelle would teach the language by using explanations, examples, and illustrations, as the students were learning the grammar and the rules. This provided the initial mental exposure. He would then reinforce this through practice, which meant that he would have the student use the new know-edge in a variety of sentences. Michelle would come back to the initial exposure and deepen the understanding until it became permanent. Understanding was demonstrated by the ability to apply the new know-edge in a variety of other circumstances. The concepts of understanding and know-edge were a critical component of Michelle's method, and we shall discuss them more extensively later in this chapter. Michelle would continually monitor what the student was saying for anything that indicated a lack of understanding. When this happened, Michelle would go back to what the student already knew and would then refresh what was not understood. At that point he would reinforce it with numerous examples until it was learned. The student was encouraged, in Michelle's words, to always think things out. With Michelle, guessing was not permitted. And from his perspective, guessing right is just an accident. In fact, for Michelle, guessing right was wrong. If the student understood and knew what Michelle was explaining, then he or she could think out the concept and then didn't need to guess. Michelle could tell what the student was thinking out, because he would have the student translate a long, complex sentence composed of different phrases, as he or she thought out, step by step, each element of the sentence. If the students made mistakes because they didn't take their time to think it out, then Michelle would know that they were guessing. Course objectives. Michelle would start all of his courses by covering the course objectives. As we have said, Michelle demanded precision in word usage and expression, and he always insisted on specifically stating the course objectives in the following manner. In 3 days you will acquire a solid comprehensive working knowledge of the entire structure and grammar of the language together with solid, practical and functional vocabulary, which will enable you to converse, read and write in all tenses without the need to memorize by rote, take notes or complete homework. After 3 days with Michelle, the student would spend 2 additional days with one of Michelle's instructors, practicing reading and speaking. Michelle Magic in the Room. The Michelle Thomas learning session differed dramatically from the way in which language courses are traditionally taught. In fact, Michelle went out of his way to insist that there be no physical, mental or spatial reminders of what we had referred to earlier as the mind prison TM. He created his own process of effortless and fun learning without using any tools, props or concepts from the traditional educational system trademark. Let's see how the master teacher accomplished his magic. Before the students arrived, they already had an idea of what they were in for with Michelle. They knew that they would learn a language in 3 days and they knew that Michelle had taught thousands of students successfully. Of course, the students did not know how he achieved his outcomes. Nevertheless, they had decided to make the necessary investment in time and money to take his course. The students wanted to master foreign language quickly, and they expected that Michelle would deliver as promised. Most of them arrived both excited and curious as to how the actual process worked. Thus began the wonderful learning journey with the master teacher. Before Michelle even uttered his first word, there was already a sense of calm and trust that permeated the atmosphere of the room, which was reinforced by his charming smile and gentle manner. As an observer on the outside looking in, one immediately had a sense of a deep connection already being established between teacher and student, unlike anything experienced in the traditional educational system trademark. There was a kind of genie says coy element of almost unreal surrender of one's mind to join that of Michelle's without any hesitation whatsoever on the part of the student or students. Michelle, with an air of reassuring self-confidence in both his voice and physiology, seemed to have already set the tone between him and his student or students. This, in turn, laid the groundwork for 3 days of sheer delight and great excitement, and astonishingly all of this in the context of language learning. I always give more than is expected, never less. And it is not being generous. This is who I am, he said. And this applies to everything that Michelle did in his personal life as well. Now the real fun began. Michelle would not waste time with small talk. He would make immediate eye contact with the student or students. As we shall later see, this detail is quite a significant part of the magic and mystery surrounding the method. When the master teacher started his language course, he would immediately lay out the course objectives followed by a set of ground rules for the course, which we will refer to as a series of initial or introductory frames. Michelle's initial frames already mark a complete break from tradition. They completely defy the traditional school rules and modalities, which are written in stone as part of the current educational system trademark. Because his frames were so diametrically opposed to the expectations of anyone who has gone through the mind prison trademark, the students already had relieved looks on their faces when he addressed them at the beginning of each course. By then they were sitting comfortably in their armchairs, as he began by telling them what they were going to achieve. You are here to learn, and what you will achieve in a matter of a few days, 3 days, is that you will have acquired a solid, comprehensive knowledge of the entire structure and grammar of the target language, including all tenses, including the subjunctive and practical and functional vocabulary. Much to their amazement, Michelle would go on to tell them that all this would be accomplished without doing the following. Without memorization, there was never anything to memorize. Without learning by rote. Without the use of textbooks. Without taking notes, notes are not allowed. Without homework, homework is absolutely not allowed, not even mental homework. Without ever trying to remember anything. Because as Michelle added, the full responsibility for your remembering will be in the teaching by teaching. At this point the students were really curious and excited. They didn't know how they could learn this way, because they had never done so before. They were used to traditional educational methods. What Michelle had just said was contrary to all of their previous learning experiences. They were about to take a journey to a new kind of learning experience, a magical one, and they were ready to discover how it worked. And in order to discover how it worked, we need to explore these initial frames to just summarize more closely. Initial frames. One of the unique aspects of Michelle's method has to do with the initial frames that he laid out at the very beginning of the learning session. A frame is a way of providing context for information in order to clarify the meaning of the content presented. If you change the frame, you will change the meaning of the content. The first frames he would set were intended to explain the contents of the course and to describe what the objectives were and how they would be achieved. Michelle would also present the time frames and the logistics of the course at the start. For Michelle's complete courses, the course would begin with 3 days with Michelle followed by 2 days with his instructors. The objective, as we have indicated, was for the learner to develop a solid and comprehensive know-edge. The emphasis is on know-edge of the entire structure of the language, meaning the entire grammar in all tenses, and the practical and functional vocabulary enabling the learner to use the language after that in speaking, reading and writing. In the course of our modeling Michelle, he would often repeat this objective, and was quite adamant about the precise wording of it. One learned all the tenses including the subjunctive. Initial frames. Course objectives. What you will accomplish. How this will be done. Make yourself comfortable. Let go of all tension. Do not write or take notes. Do not try to remember. Remembering is the teacher's and not the learner's responsibility. Give yourself time to think. Never get annoyed at yourself if you make a mistake. Let go of all expectations. Learning should be accompanied by a feeling of great joy. All of this was achieved without the traditional modalities, without drills, memorizing, learning by rote, taking notes and homework, not even mental homework, which Michelle said was absolutely not allowed. There were no textbooks and there was nothing to read during the initial 3 days. One would certainly not be allowed to take notes. Every one of the traditional modalities mentioned here creates a great deal of tension in the learner, and Michelle realized that tension is one of the greatest enemies of learning. For this reason he wanted no part of these negative associations incorporated in his learning process. Hence, Michelle would go to great lengths to remove any possible source of tension in the learner from the very beginning. Although we will elaborate on this further in this chapter, we will briefly mention that Michelle would inform his students from the start that he, as their teacher, would be taking full responsibility for their learning and for their remembering. One may ask how it is possible to learn to speak, read and write a language without textbooks, without rote memorization and without taking notes. This is what was so amazing about Michelle's method. During the learning process where one doesn't take notes and one doesn't have textbooks, one learns how to pronounce and how to spell correctly. He explained this as follows: if you know how to spell, then you will also know how to write. And if you know how to write, then you will know how to read. It is exciting to see that after 3 days students who started with zero knowledge of the language will be able to read. And they will also be able to pronounce correctly what they are reading. They will know where to put the stress on words. Students were always surprised to learn that there was no note-taking in Michelle's courses and that it should be of no concern. About being concerned, a former student, a medical journalist said, not at all, because part of Michelle's genius is a real systems person is the built-in redundancy. After 3 days with Michelle, the learner would spend another 2 days with Michelle's instructors reading and discussing. In this 2-day period, the learner would develop further proficiency. Here the students were given short contemporary passages to read and discuss. This helped to build up vocabulary and started the student in the process of reading the language. Discussion took place in the target language. After these 2 days, the learner would be encouraged to spend only 10 minutes a day on a daily basis reading a newspaper, magazine, or interview of interest to him or her in the newly acquired language. According to Michelle, spending 10 minutes a day was much more important and more effective than spending a few hours a week doing the same thing. Also, Michelle preferred that the reading be done without the use of a dictionary. The key was to be consistent. Learning environment, ease of learning. Early on, Michelle realized the importance of appropriate settings, or learning environments, that support and nurture learning and the acquisition of knowledge. He created a specific physical and mental environment that supports the entire learning process from its very inception. The result was a self-sustaining system that maintained a tension-free atmosphere, which enhanced the entire learning process from start to finish, even deepening it as the session continued. The ambience that Michelle created served to help unleash at a deep level one's vast learning potential. The physical structure he created to support the learning process complemented the clever structuring of the mental associations of the subject matter. These elements are two parts of the same whole. Further in this chapter, we will discuss the latter in more detail. Why did Michelle take such great care over the orchestration of the learning milieu? Michelle discovered that within everyone there is innate potential for learning. He also realized that the degree of this potential can vary depending on the individual and on the learning milieu. Michelle did not base his method on any sensitivity or feeling for languages on the part of the student. His method was designed to teach even those learners who believe that they are incapable of learning a foreign language. Furthermore, certain conditions are necessary to actualize the innate drive for learning, which Michelle believed to be the most important thing that every student possesses. At a very deep level, Michelle knew that this innate drive was still undiscovered and ignored by the traditional educational system, in which he said that teachers choke the drive through misuse and ignorance. Michelle further explained his insistence on creating a particular ambience that is conducive to learning. I think that it is self-evident that these inner potentials require the right environment in order to take off and soar. If not, they will remain just that, potentials, dormant perhaps, as they so frequently are in students within traditional classroom settings. This is why I am insistent upon a particular kind of milieu. I look for an environment defined by years of exam and experience, because I look for the breakthrough that leads to tapping the learning potential within each student. Now this is a tenet of my method. With a carefully wrought system administered under replicable conditions, a breakthrough will occur and stimulate those innate potentials. The potentials of students are immense because of this drive. This is why Michelle took such great care in the creation and maintenance of both the physical and physiological elements of the learning environment to reawaken this innate drive. Moreover, Michelle realized that once one taps into the learning potential and once the breakthrough occurs, it is necessary to sustain and to deepen it. He also had a method in which to do this, as we shall see later in this chapter. Michelle's method was based on the development of self-worth in the student. Michelle was aware of the physiological principle that each successive interaction in one's environment generates important feelings of personal efficacy and self-worth. Michelle also realized the following: specific feedback derived from formative evaluation procedures students were assessed while in progress rather than at the end stimulates the competence motive for all students. This is why Michelle would use constant reinforcement as part of his method. It allows the student to monitor his or her own progress and to experience immediately the immense joy and excitement that it generates. This is the key to sustaining and enhancing the innate learning potential. A unique learning ambience. So, how would Michelle create the special physical and physiological ambience that enhances learning? First, let us describe the physical setting. Michelle taught his live course in his office or in a comfortable setting elsewhere. The room always included comfortable armchairs. In Michelle's office, there were comfortable leather armchairs for both Michelle and the learner. There were plants, a table and a lamp. Plants and or flowers were an important ingredient in this ambience. Michelle believed that it was not necessary to have a table or desk on which to write, for the simple reason that the student had no need to write anything or to take notes. Also, the room should be neat and clean and there should be no distractions. Ideally, rooms should have windows, otherwise the students are enclosed in a windowless space, which will trigger an unconscious feeling of entrapment and the negative tension creating associations that are connected to the mind prison trademark. In creating a carefully constructed learning environment, Michelle went to great lengths to erase all previous negative associations with learning. Michelle's learning environment was as far removed from a classroom, physically and physiologically, as one could get. In it we found no visual, no auditory, no kinesthetic or olfactory reminders of the traditional classroom. For example, in his ideal learning environment there were no desks and no blackboards or flip charts or overhead projectors. There was no smell of chalk or erasers or of magic markers. There were no school bells and no class schedules. Rather, it was a physical space, where traditional belief systems had been replaced by Michelle's unique perspective on the learning process of the human mind, which created and reinforced new beliefs about learning. We have just discussed the elements of the physical learning environment, which the master teacher intentionally designed. There is another aspect of the learning environment to consider. How did Michelle create the concomitant physiological environment for learning? Let us assume a scenario in which there was one learner taking the course in Michelle's learning space. The student was ushered into a comfortable room as previously described. The learner was already comfortable when Michelle entered the room. Michelle would greet the learner, would shake the person's hand and would then sit down right across from the learner. With his approachable yet confident manner and warm smile, Michelle would always immediately put the learner at ease. Michelle's demeanor was gentle and non-threatening. His voice was calm and steady, yet subtly tinged with a hint of excitement. He would not waste time on small talk, but jump right into the task at hand, doing what he did best with great passion. Michelle did not believe in authoritarian teaching, nor did he believe that the teacher should be put on a pedestal, as in the traditional educational system trademark. Over the years, Michelle had witnessed a typical teacher-student interaction in the current educational system trademark. He would always get quite upset whenever he spoke about the lack of communication between teacher and student. Even worse, he said, is that teachers love to get in front of a class, to lecture for hours merely, to show off what they think they know. Real teaching versus lecturing. Michelle was not fond of lecturing. From his perspective, lecturing does not constitute what he called proper or real teaching. He thought that in some cases lecturing may be about showing off on the part of certain teachers, and at the same time he acknowledged that there were some good teachers who were not about showing off. He believed that in certain cases lecturing could be an acceptable means of teaching when done effectively. However, with lecturing there was the issue of connecting with students. For Michelle, this connection was a vital aspect of proper or real teaching and represented a core issue. As Michelle explained, when teachers lecture, they usually do not connect with their students. They do not know what their students are thinking. Michelle stressed that lecturing per se was not the problem. Instead, it is a matter of how it is done. In this vein, Michelle explained that teachers should know how to receive. In the rare moments when Michelle would lecture, he was the receiver. If teachers don't connect with their students, then how are they to know whether or not the students understand the subject matter? Lecturing makes it very difficult to do. Michelle thought that teachers who lecture cannot decipher a student's needs, and if they cannot read their students, then they should not be lecturing. The usual purpose of most lectures is to reel off lots of data, which is to be regurgitated back in the form of tests. We know that tests do not assess understanding. In some, although not in all cases, tests can be a way to simply feed the lecturer's narcissism by mirroring back the information presented. It's often another way of placing the teacher on a pedestal. Michelle, on the other hand, believed that the teacher and student are on an equal level. From his perspective, teachers who lecture often expressing the needs of their ego to stand out among the crowd and show off their perceived superiority over their students. Often they simply want to hear themselves talk. In Michelle's world, there was no sense of superiority on his part. He did not feel the need to engage in power plays or in ego games, nor did he believe that they should ever be part of proper or real teaching. The process here is all about collaborative learning. Real teaching is interactive and is not lecturing, according to Michelle. Unfortunately, lecturing is something which has been done for centuries. As we mentioned in chapter 4, even worse was that in the past, lectures were conducted in Latin and not in the language of the people. Michelle was always emphatic, a teacher does not lecture. For Michelle, the essence of real teaching is interchange. Teaching is an interchange involving explaining and responding, which leads to understanding and knowledge. Michelle, the master teacher in every way, would always be aware of students' emotional states, blocks, prior traumatic learning experiences, etc. that could interfere or create tension and therefore negatively impact learning. Furthermore, he would be quick to remedy the situation. Michelle was able to do this because he didn't lecture. Instead, he would connect with his students on a deep level. He would achieve this in a deliberate manner, as we shall see later in this chapter in our discussion of group dynamics. The students were like cherished flowers. Michel did not merely water the flowers. He would nurture them as well. As we have said, once the student was comfortably seated in his learning environment, Michel would lay out the course outcomes and the initial learning frames. He would begin by telling the student exactly what the course consisted of and what to expect. This was followed by the learning frames, which further enhanced the physiological environment for learning to occur. The learning frames involved the do's and the don'ts. The do's included letting go of all tension and being comfortable. The elimination of all tension. There are three critically important concepts to understanding the master-teacher's method. These involve 1. The elimination of all tension, 2. Remembering, 3. The relation between understanding and knowledge. These three concepts help to explain how Michel's method differed from traditional methods. We need to discuss each one in turn in order to provide a basis for a deeper understanding of the Michel-Thomas method. We will begin with Michel's ideas on the elimination of tension. Educators often place an emphasis on relaxation. For Michel, this is to put the cart before the horse. Instead, for Michel, the important thing is to eliminate any form of tension. Then relaxation will naturally follow. Michel clarified the tension relaxation dichotomy in this way: to relax and to try to relax are not so important. To me, what I am watching for is not to have any form of tension. And once you remove tension, relaxation will come automatically. You can be comfortable and relaxed and still build up a lot of tension. Again, we are talking here about important concepts. As trainers, we know that holding tension in the mind-body inhibits the rate at which students learn, while tension-free students will find the doors to learn wide open within them. Michel tried to remove all tension before he even started the language learning process. He did this immediately, as soon as he uttered his first word about his objectives. Michel explained it as follows: they are listening to me and listening to me. I am not telling them to relax really. I don't use the word relax. They are in comfortable chairs, so I don't need to tell them to relax. I tell them that they will be exposed to a method where they are not to try to remember anything. The emphasis is on trying. Remembering is one thing, but don't try. Whatever you do, don't try to remember, and I will tell them why. Because the responsibility for your remembering is with me. It is my job. Remembering is not your job. Not trying to remember immediately removes tension and brings about relaxation. So don't try. If I say that, then that immediately removes tension. Thus, all the remembering on the part of the students was Michel's responsibility. How can they be anything but relaxed? This emphasis on the removal of tension is surprisingly new to all of the students. He described his interaction with his students in the following way: I don't want to call it shock. It is not a shock, because the word shock creates tension. It is instead amazement. So they say, you don't want me to try, so I won't try. It is easier for them to talk about remembering. I don't want you to try, because the responsibility for your remembering is my job. Don't try to take my job away from me. If you don't remember something, it is up to me to know why you don't remember. It is up to me to know why you don't remember and to know what to do about it. So the process, what to do about your remembering is my job. Don't try to do it yourself. With this, I remove already all tension before I even start. Imagine learning between 18 and 22 tenses in 3 days and having the responsibility for remembering them all placed on the shoulders of the teacher. That is precisely what Michel was so delighted to do every time he taught a course. In the traditional mind prison trademark, remembering is equated with memorizing. The student has to work at it, has to do homework, has to work hard, and has to get good grades. By contrast, Michel was assuming full responsibility for remembering and taking away from the student the anxiety created by the burden of memorizing and cramming. Michel explained further, another important thing that comes up with the distinction between relaxation and removal of tension. One usually succeeds in removing all tension before I even start with what I just explained. That is already done. On some occasions, some learners may tense up, and that will register in me if they do it. I notice it immediately and do something to remove the source of the tension. Often learners, themselves, are carriers of anxiety and tension. They bring in the baggage of tension with them because this is what they have learned to do in the traditional educational system. Others may maintain tension in their bodies due to personal or professional problems. They have learned how to increase their tension levels by memorizing, and by cramming, and their tension is only released by testing. Then they can forget everything and begin the process again. For many learners, forgetting is actually the release of their tension, that is, the tension of cramming and memorizing. This is a mental release. Michel's method was designed to dispel this tension from the beginning by removing its source. The method completely removes any form of tension or any form of anxiety that will interfere with learning. Relaxation is a byproduct of this effort. So Michel succeeded in breaking down the traditional belief systems around learning, and especially in respect to language learning belief systems that have been passed from one generation to the next. He succeeded in completely eliminating the negative associations attached to the traditional learning process listed below. Traditional demands of learning. Learning means hard work. Learning means trying hard. Learning creates pain. Learning requires concentrated effort. Learning demands study. Learning generates tension. Learning requires homework. Learning creates anxiety. Learning requires memorizing and learning by rote. Learning requires cramming for tests. Let us summarize how Michel's method differs from traditional teaching methods. First, there is no need to write or to take notes. With Michel's learning process, learning is easy, a source of immense pleasure, and creates great excitement. There is no hard work, no trying hard, no pain, no concentrated effort required, no study, no tension, no homework, and no anxiety. Furthermore, there are no blackboards or visual aids, and there are no textbooks. There will be no lectures and tests. Real teaching is not lecturing. As Michel always emphasized, learning will take place without memorization, without drills, without learning by rote, without taking notes, which is not allowed, without textbooks, and without homework, which is absolutely not allowed. All of these frames do two things. First, they remove all associations with previous learning situations about which the student may feel negatively. Second, they remove all sources of tension associated with traditional learning methods. What are some of the things that produce tension? First, is an authoritarian teacher. Second, is a teacher who lectures, and a student furiously trying to take notes to keep up with what the teacher is saying. Third, are homework assignments which fill up the time outside of class and achieve little. Fourth, are textbooks which must be studied and remembered. Fifth, are papers and reports which take time to write, and often students are simply regurgitating information with no real understanding or acquisition of no edge. Underlying all of these things is the element that is the greatest source of tension testing and grading the anxiety and tension associated with them. In Michel's method, as we have seen, all of these are eliminated. Why does the removal of tension facilitate learning? In our own work as trainers and coaches, we have discovered that tension exists in the mind and in the body. Both physical and mental tensions are unconscious responses to stress and anxiety. Human beings don't consciously tense. They unconsciously tense. Telling people to relax does not remove the tension. They may be able to consciously control physical tension temporarily, but as soon as they go unconscious, the tension will return. Tension distracts attention from the here and now and focuses it on the future. Mental tension occupies the mind with worry and stress, producing anxiety. All of this interferes with learning, which can only occur in what we call in the now, or the present moment. Thinking now can only occur in the now. So all tension, mental and physical, interferes with learning. Tension drains attention and the ability to focus. And physical tension drains energy. Anything that diverts attention and energy will adversely affect learning. So how does one get rid of physical and mental tension? Michel had a simple answer. Eliminate the source and cause of the tension from the beginning. Tension is an unconscious response to a stressful environment. Remove the stress in the environment and the tension will disappear. This is why Michel so carefully crafted his initial frames to eliminate all stress and anxiety from the beginning. Michel realized that even if he placed no stress on the students can still manufacture it themselves. So Michel also had to prevent the students from producing stress for themselves. He did this in two ways. First is by removing all responsibility for learning from the students. Second is by giving the students a continual series of positive reinforcements which continually build their feelings of personal efficacy and self-worth. With all responsibility for learning gone and with no anxiety and with continual success, all tension quickly drops away and learning is free to occur. The paradox of trying. As we have just explained, the notion of tension was an interesting one in the world of Michel-Thomas. He was quite adamant in asserting that tension within the traditional system is based on certain learning modalities which are inherent in the system, on cramming for tests, on memorizing, on rote learning, and on homework. In this light, it is important to understand the distinction that Michel made between tension and relaxation. First of all, in Michel's world, unlike in the traditional system, tension does not exist. As we have seen, from the very beginning frame he would lay out, Michel's goal was the total removal of L tension, and not relaxation. An interesting paradox of sorts exists here. In order to create relaxation, you have to try to relax. And trying produces tension. A student may say, I'm going to try to relax. That merely generates tension. Instead, Michel was a master of completely removing tension, as we pointed out earlier. Furthermore, within the traditional educational system trademark, students come to class with tension, with expectations and with anxieties, all of which create more tension. There is an immediate association created of I'll try. Or I don't know if it will work, but I'll try anyway. Thus, with expectation and anxiety there is tension, made more intense by trying, and the tension is saying not to relax. According to Michel, the tension has to be totally, and I mean totally, removed in order to create the receptivity for real learning. Creating tension merely serves to block the mind. When tense, the student is basically learning only with his conscious mind, although minimally, when, in fact, learning should occur ideally with a balance of using both the conscious and subconscious minds. What a waste to simply tap into only part of the potential of the human mind. The wonder of the subconscious mind is that it acts like an eternal sponge, soaking in everything, encoding it in the mind forever. Any tension, however, will close rather quickly the doors to the subconscious mind. So, why should it be surprising that Michel conferred a rather dubious description of prison to our present educational system? Instead of sparking excitement in students, as did Michel's personal method with his own students, the traditional system uses a learning process that turns mostly people off. Why? Because, as Michel beautifully expressed, it is based on work, tension, on paying attention, on cramming, on memorization, and on concentration, all words which, in themselves, unconsciously create tension in the mind as well as in the body. Cramming, memorization, and learning by rote have no place in Michel's world. The current educational system trademark is based on these ineffective learning methods. Cramming all night and day for a test does not accomplish anything. One ends up having to take a meaningless multiple choice test, where one is presented with 4 or 5 choices. From the start, one can eliminate at least 2 of the options because they do not make sense. More often than not, one is in a situation of guessing between 2 possible answers. Success or failure on a test comes down, then to correct guessing. One may be fortunate or lucky enough to be able to pass a test without knowing anything, simply by guessing the correct answer. The whole process is insane. Even if one were to remember what one learned in cramming for a test, we all know that one would not be able to retake the test just 5 days later with the same results. We will discuss further the concept of memorization, guessing, cramming for tests, etc. later in this chapter. In our work as professional behavioral modelers and trainers, we are well aware of the profound mind-body connection, and over the years we have witnessed firsthand how tension created in the mind is necessarily linked to the physical body, where it creates real muscle tension. Muscle tension, in turn, creates fatigue. All of our work and research on learning and training has shown that learning is blocked when the mind-body connection is stressed and tense. Moreover, the mind-body connection affects attitude. The end result is an unpleasant learning experience for the student in which his mind, body, and spirit have been poisoned by tension and attention. We would also like to take note of the notion of fatigue, because in the context of learning, fatigue is an interesting concept. First, it is important to know what one means by fatigue. For example, there is both mental and physical fatigue, and they do not necessarily go together. Indeed, a person may be extremely physically fatigued, but it will not prevent the person from receiving messages from the teacher, or from understanding and absorbing what is being taught, because the person is not mentally fatigued. In fact, the excitement of learning can actually help the person to forget the physical fatigue. The same goes for teachers, and Michel easily attested to this fact based on a personal experience about a year before his passing. At the end of 2003, Michel was hit by a car while crossing the street in front of his home. And, as we indicated in his biographical vignette, Michel had an amazing history of experiencing larger-than-life situations. Nothing had changed after all these years. He was not just hit by some little vehicle. No, it was a stretch limousine. Fortunately for all of us, Michel's split-second, lightning-quick reflexes saved him from real serious injury or death at that time. The point is that even after being badly bruised and in the hospital on force, Michel was nevertheless determined to teach his class 2 days after the accident, and once again, achieved his usual phenomenal result in spite of his less than perfect physical condition. The student was never even aware of what had happened to him. Being struck by a stretch limousine could not even squelch Michel's innate drive. Here was the perfect example of how Michel's excitement of teaching spurred him to do what many others might think impossible. The very excitement of teaching helped him to forget the physical pain and discomfort he was experiencing as a result of his accident. How many teachers or students do you know who would have reacted in such a way? Very few, because as Michel would frequently point out, the excitement for learning does not exist in them. He believed that more often than not, students will find some lame excuse to not attend school for just a little cold, because their innate drive for learning still remains dormant and their excitement has been stifled. From day 1, the child goes to school with tension and comes home only to be exposed to additional tension by parents who ask, what did you learn in school today? The tension is once again reinforced on an even higher level, so that the child walks around carrying tension in his entire body. The parent then admonishes the child for not answering the question, as the parent would like. This is exactly the opposite of what learning should be. All learning, asserted Michel, should begin or lead into a tremendous feeling of excitement, of high excitement. Mere excitement is not enough. Learning must engender great excitement, otherwise it cannot be legitimately called learning in Michel's view. In some circles, tension is actually expected, because it has become so assimilated into the system that it, quite frankly, appears to be the norm. It is as though if you don't feel tense when learning, then something is wrong with you. Children then carry their mental and physical tension into adulthood. Both adults and children bring negative expectations about learning with them wherever they go. Michel would recall many times in conversations just how many adults he had seen over the years who literally breathed tension daily when he met them for the first time. They, however, are the fortunate ones who had crossed Michel's path. Thanks to Michel's brilliant method and reassuring manner, these lucky individuals were effortlessly transformed into tension-free students who came away having learned an additional valuable tool they had otherwise never thought possible: proficiency in a foreign language in 3 days. Interestingly, Michel's teaching experience had confirmed many times over that the more university degrees a person has, the more difficult and challenging it is to open the doors of their minds to learning in a new way. In fact, the more successful these people have been in school, in terms of passing the requisite tests to get their respective degrees within the existing system, the more resistant they are to giving up old patterns and to opening up to new ways of learning. The result was that it took Michel a little longer to teach them using his method, because his approach was so antithetical to the one used in the traditional system. He found that those within the system who are most successful are very proud of their success and of their ability to learn by following the rules of the traditional system. The other interesting phenomenon of these so-called successful students is that they were always the ones among Michel's students who blamed themselves when they made a mistake. Michel was quick to tell them not to blame themselves, because he was the one who accepted total responsibility for their learning. As we shall see in the next section, in Michel's world, the responsibility for remembering is the responsibility of the teacher. If students made a mistake, it was his problem, not theirs. It is up to the teacher to determine why the mistake was made in the first place, and to do something about it. This unique concept of the teacher taking complete responsibility for learning and for remembering rather than the student is a major key to the Michel-Thomas method, as we will now explain. The secret of remembering. Michel's initial frames or ground rules did not stop with his ideas on tension and on trying. The next frames deal with what we call the secret of remembering. These frames serve to refine Michel's concept of not trying to remember. In the previous section, we discussed this component of the method in relation to the notion of tension. We would now like to consider this component of not trying to remember from the perspective of what we have named memory mechanisms, TM. Michel specifically explained to us his concept of not trying to remember as follows. 120. What I expect from you, and this is very important, is that you never try to remember. And I emphasize never to try to remember because the trying, not the remembering, is tension producing and will interfere with learning. I want to make it clear that when I say never try to remember, it doesn't mean not to remember, but it means not to try. Never try to remember because this is a method where the responsibility for your remembering lies with the teacher, not with the learner. All of your remembering is my responsibility. Your responsibility is not to try. This means that at any point, if you don't remember anything whatsoever, then you don't have to try. It is not your responsibility. It is my responsibility equal 10. And it is up to me, and it will always be up to me to know why you don't remember and what to do about it. That is my job, and don't try to take it away from me. As one can see, Michel was quite precise with his wording of the concept of not trying to remember, for it is such a critical part of his method. and he will frequently come back to it in his teaching, just as he did during our modeling process. Michelle would assume full responsibility for what was happening at every moment, for remembering, for learning, and for retention of content. Just saying this produced the immediate effect of removing any sense of self-consciousness on the part of the students, which would otherwise inhibit their learning process. The students knew that Michelle was the giver and they, as learners, were the receivers. They simply had to sit back and accept the gifts of understanding, know, and joy which Michelle would offer them. True learning lies in good teaching, and in his teaching Michelle welcomed the responsibility for the students' learning with open arms. There was no need for the students to feel guilty or to lose confidence. Any mistakes were transformed into understanding. The students end up understanding what they did and why they made the mistake, and they appreciated their individual progress all the more. At times you may get annoyed with yourself and say, "Oh, I should know it, don't." It is up to me, declared Michelle. The Oscar-winning British actress, Emma Thompson, learned Spanish from Michelle in 1997, and is an outspoken fan of both the man and his method. In an article which appeared in The Guardian several years later, she recalled an incident which made a lasting impression upon her. "I couldn't remember something simple and I started to cry because I was frustrated with myself." He said, "You don't understand, it's my fault, and the effect of it is remarkable. It forces you to relax." This is precisely what Michelle accomplished every time he taught. Michelle would lift the burden of responsibility off of the student, and in so doing release the tension associated with it. By the way, if anyone had ever tried to take the responsibility of learning away from Michelle, they would have wondered what hit them. This concept of not trying to remember is a critical component of Michelle's method, and he would often purposefully repeat himself in order to drive in the point. That is the reason why we often come back to this concept as we proceed in the discussion of his method. Michelle wanted to stress the importance of not trying to remember and in explaining his approach to us. He made a very clear distinction between trying to remember and remembering. He insisted that the two should not be confused. Remembering occurs when one does not try. Trying, as we have said, is tension producing while remembering is not. When a student didn't remember something, it may have been that he did not quite understand. It is certainly not because the student did not try hard enough. It was up to Michelle, the teacher, to determine why the student did not understand a particular concept in the first place, which is a far cry from traditional education. Michelle believed that the effort to remember creates two problems. First, it doesn't work. Trying to remember, cramming, or rote learning may lead to short-term recall, and it is just as quickly forgotten. In fact, forgetting is often the mental release of the tension of cramming and trying to remember. Cramming, in the sense of cramming to pass a test, is a complete waste of time, because one is simply not able to repeat the same test 5 days later. As Michelle rightfully pointed out, you may be a good student who passes tests. So what? Memorization is merely recollection and is not learning. He added that memorization is a forced process, which blocks the natural learning channels of the mind. Crammed knowledge and memorized knowledge do not represent real know-edge, because real know-edge is based on understanding. The second problem is that trying to do anything produces tension. Trying to remember produces even greater tension. Michelle's method was designed to eliminate all tension. With the concept of the teacher assuming the entire responsibility for remembering, Michelle made an important distinction. He was not taking over the responsibility of the student's memory. Rather, he was taking charge of their remembering. And remembering has to be based on understanding. Michelle stated this well, remembering without understanding is memorizing. In summary, Michelle's frames were as follows. Why there is nothing to memorize. Why don't try to remember anything. Why there is no memorization or rote learning. Why there is no trying. Why there is no making any effort to remember. Why one should not try to remember from one second to the next. Why there is no trying to remember anything. Why, simply put, there is no trying. These are the essence of our memory mechanisms. Trademark. Michelle thought that our choice of expression was a perfect description for what he did as part of his method. When Michelle would introduce a new concept, the tendency for many people was to try to grasp it and hold onto it. The reaction is like, "Oh, that is something new, and I have to remember it." But after he erases it and makes it difficult to come back to it. While the student is trying to remember it, he or she is stuck in the past. The very act of trying to hold on to it causes the student to lose it. Michelle's point was to let it go, because he would come back and reinforce it. It was not necessary to grasp it completely the first time, because Michelle deliberately built redundancy into his teaching and would reinforce the concept until it became natural. It may seem arbitrary the first time, but after several times it would become natural. So when Michelle would make what he called an initial imprint, it was important to leave it alone, not to hold on to it. If you left it alone, then it was there for you. In fact, Michelle always would find it to be an interesting process to come back to it. When Michelle returned to it, the student would either immediately know it or he or she would have had what Michelle called the aha experience or aha reaction. This aha experience would, in turn, deepen the imprint and then the student would know it. If they didn't have the experience, Michelle would reinforce it once again. He said that it was rare for him to come back to it a second time without an immediate reaction from the student. Michelle found this to be an interesting phenomenon from a learning perspective. We will come back to Michelle's concept of imprints later in the chapter. So why did what we named Michelle's memory mechanisms TM and remembering instructions work so well? We have found that there are two key points in answer to this. First is to eliminate anything that will interfere with memory. The primary thing that needs to be eliminated is any tension from stress, anxiety, or expectation. Michelle accomplished this by placing the responsibility for remembering on himself and not on the student. Second is the memory process itself. Remembering is largely an unconscious process. It occurs automatically in conscious act WR. Trying, on the other hand, is a conscious process. Conscious trying interferes with unconscious remembering. Holding onto the moment is a conscious process. As soon as we try to hold on to the moment, that moment is in the past and we are no longer in the now or the present moment. We can't emphasize enough the fact that learning and remembering occur in the now. By not trying to hold on, we are able to stay in the now and to allow the automatic memory process to function. The truth about memory. In our own research on learning over the years which we incorporated into our learning how to learn technology TM in the early 1990s and into our trainings ever since, we discovered several important truths regarding memory, which will shed light on why Michelle's approach was so effective. We found that memory is a three-way process. First, one must capture the information in short-term memory from the start. Second, one must place it in storage in long-term memory. Third, one must be able to recall it out of long-term memory. These processes all occur automatically as well as unconsciously with no effort on our part. We remember many things without ever having tried either to remember them or to recall them. The process just happens unconsciously. There is a great deal of research on memory. This research indicates that there is a correlation between the time spent studying and the amount recalled. The same research indicates, however, that the study methods are more important than the time spent studying. Research concludes that it is very difficult to remember nonsense syllables, but it is easy to remember information that is organized and interconnected. In other words, it is easiest to remember things that are clearly explained and that can fit easily into our previously existing understanding. It is difficult to remember anything that is confusing or anything out of which one cannot make sense. This is why clear explanations are so important. They connect up what we are learning to what we already know. Trying harder to remember what is confusing is not the answer. Garbage in, garbage out, as the saying goes. The solution to memory is not to put more effort into it. In fact, this has the opposite effect. The solution is to provide clear explanations that lead to automatic and unconscious recall. Michelle brilliantly devised a component of his method, which we have chosen to name meaningful memory associations TM, which are, in essence, powerful heuristic devices to assist memory. We will discuss this element of the Michelle-Thomas method in more detail in a later section. For the purpose of the present discussion, we would like to stress that memory research shows that a powerful association to something that we already know is one of the best ways to remember. Research also shows, as Michelle often pointed out, that it is easy to remember the lyrics to a song or the words to a poem that one sings. Research indicates that the use of mnemonics and singing or chanting is also a powerful way to remember. For example, opera singers always remember what they sing. They are capable of singing an aria at any time. Average people can also often remember lyrics to a song that they particularly like. The real issue here is, why do we forget? We forget because of interference. We remember what is unique, but we can't remember what is indistinguishable from everything else. This is another reason why clear explanations are so important. They enable us to fit new information into our existing knowledge base. Explanations allow us to take and to connect up with what we already know. Memorization and cramming are conscious processes involving repetition. They focus on remembering rather than on connecting. Memorization and cramming are problematic in two ways. First is the fact that what is memorized is quickly forgotten because it is not connected to something we know. Second is that simply parroting back information does not produce the understanding, which is critical to knowing. This leads us to Michel's next critically important component of his method, which is the concept of understanding. Also, as we will see in the next chapter on theory and practice, this issue lies at the heart of one of the major shifts in modern pedagogical thinking. We will also see that Michel is far ahead of today's new school of thought. The key to understanding. We have already mentioned the importance of the master teacher's beliefs about learning and understanding and memory. Let us summarize them briefly. Learning is based on understanding and knowing. What one knows, which is based on understanding, one will never forget. Understanding means that the know-edge is organized and interconnected. The key to education is to transfer understanding, which leads to the acquisition of know-edge. The evidence of understanding is the ability to generalize and to apply the know-edge to solve problems in different situations. You can memorize a set of formulas, which students often do, but this does not mean that you will be able to apply the formulas in the real world to solve problems. This requires understanding and know-edge and critical thinking. Michel emphasized that everything is understood in the moment. Learning is what we call in our terminology and time process, one that occurs in the present moment, in the now. Learning does not occur in the past or in the future. Michel wanted learners not to try to hold on to the moment of understanding because he would come back to it and deepen it until it became permanent. In short, understanding and know-edge, and not rote memory, are the key to learning. Regarding this distinction, Michel often iterated a personal mantra of sorts: you can't forget what you know and understand. What one knows, one will never forget. You may block it for a moment, but you can't forget it. You may block what you know, as, for example, with the tip of the tongue phenomena, but you can't forget it. There is an interesting twist about remembering and blocking, which we will touch upon. How often do you hear someone say, don't forget? One first has to know something in order to forget it. So to say, don't forget means nothing unless you already knew something about what you are told not to forget. If a person is referring to an event or situation which one has never experienced, then one is incapable of remembering the event or situation in the first place. Sometimes people would like to forget what they know, or they may not like to remind themselves of something, someone, or some event that became knowledge to them. The truth of the matter is that they really have not forgotten what they know. They are simply blocking it, and have merely chosen to not pay attention to it, or to not refer to it in their own minds. Moreover, they may be successful in blocking what they know, but they are not forgetting even if they think that they are. There is a huge difference between blocking and forgetting. To forget refers to something one actually really didn't know in the first place. However, when you acquire that which Michel referred to as know-edge, you don't forget. If it is true that what you know, you will not forget, then you don't have to worry about remembering. Blocking is different. Michel gave the example of a person who temporarily can recall his or her own telephone number. What happens is that this makes people think that they are forgetful. It means nothing, however, according to Michel, and he explained it as normal, because for a moment one is blocking one's own telephone number. It doesn't mean that the person has actually forgotten his or her own number. In such a case, it doesn't mean forgetting, it means blocking. Then the person begins to think badly about himself or herself. What is the matter with me, he or she may ask. That serves to create tension, of course. And the harder we try to remember that name or number, the more tense we become. In our terminology, blocking means that you know the information, but at the given moment it is not in your conscious awareness. What we mean by this is that the information is in the subconscious mind and can be retrieved under appropriate circumstances. The subconscious does not respond well to trying, which is a conscious activity. This just further blocks the subconscious mind. Once we stop making a conscious effort and allow the subconscious mind to function on its own, the information will just pop up automatically. Another example of blocking occurs in everyday conversation. One may be talking to someone else and say, it's on the tip of my tongue. This is the same phenomenon as the example of the telephone number. It is not forgetting. Once again, it is blocking. What you end up doing once again is telling your body to tense up on a subconscious level. It is almost impossible to find the name or number in the mind when it is blocked. The more you try, the more you block. It's that simple. Michel explains blocking to mean that something is submerged. He described this to us as follows: you put it down, it disappears from the surface and you are unable to find it. It is no longer on the surface, and the more you look for it, the more you push it down, the deeper it goes and the more you end up blocking it. Such blocks happen to everyone, and Michel's advice was simply not to worry about it. He suggested to release the pressure of the push and let it pop up. What he meant is that we simply let go of the block by thinking of another word or set of words instead. As for the phone number, the more that you are trying to remember it, the deeper that you are pushing it down, the more you are submerging it. In essence, what he was saying is that if you try to think about the word at the tip of your tongue, the deeper it goes into the subconscious mind. Michel's advice was to just forget the word and to use another word or even a sentence in its place. Then the word for which you were searching, which was submerged, will immediately pop up. Also, if you know it, you will expect it to pop up. How many times have you been in a situation in which you tried to remember the title of a song or the name of a character in a book? The more you tried to remember, the more difficult the task became. Then, suddenly when you release the pressure of trying to remember, the word pops up in an instant. Thus, simply put, blocking is not forgetting. What you understand becomes know-edge, and what you know becomes part of you. It becomes a permanent part of you, and what you know, you don't forget. What you know, you will never forget. You may block, but you will not forget. Understanding. The word understanding was an important concept for the master teacher. There is a danger, however, of misunderstanding what he meant by it, so it is important to take a moment here to clarify what Michel meant when he used the word. The problem arises because the word understanding is ambiguous, and is often used in two different senses in English. One sense is to know thoroughly, to grasp or perceive clearly and fully the nature, character and functioning of a thing. This is the sense in which Michel used the word. Another sense of understanding is to comprehend, to get or perceive the meaning of. Understanding and comprehension are often used interchangeably, but more precisely, understanding stresses the full awareness of know-edge arrived at, while comprehension is the process of grasping something mentally. The critical point is that in this sense one may comprehend the words in a statement without understanding yet, or what is meant by them. Whenever we refer to understanding here in the context of Michel's method, we will mean know-edge and not comprehension. As Michel would often declare, the objective of learning is to gain know-edge. Now we would like to make some distinctions, which will clarify further the notion of understanding to which we refer. In order to do this, let us consider what are known as facts. Facts are isolated and learned one at a time. How do facts relate to understanding? Understanding involves connecting and integrating the facts together so that they form a whole, which is greater than the sum of the parts. A focus on remembering the parts obscures the vision of the whole. It is the whole that counts. You can't make applications or solve problems from the parts alone. It is only the organized whole, which shows how the pieces fit together, that allows you to solve problems or to make applications. Michel's goal was the practical use of a foreign language. He knew full well that one does not learn to speak a language by memorizing grammatical rules and vocabulary and verb conjugations. Instead, one learns to speak a language by understanding the connections and by practice. Michel's original impulse to teach languages was to probe the learning process of the human mind. In the process of this exploration, Michel made some interesting discoveries about how the learning process works, which he described as follows. Let me explain something which is very important. What I expect from any student, to me it's always the same, whether it's one student or the whole class. All learners know that I emphasize this, that what I expect, and what I want is that when I explain something for them, they need to fully understand it. But understanding to me means understanding just for the moment. When I explain something, I want it fully understood at that moment. And he added that if something is not fully understood at that moment, then the student needs to ask questions to make sure that it is fully understood. To be fully understood means that it makes sense in terms of what the student already knows, and that it does not contradict or conflict with existing knowledge. At the moment of first exposure, all of the connections are not necessarily clear. And once again, it is important not to try to figure out the implications at the moment. They will be revealed as the learning session goes on. If it is unclear, then it needs to be clarified. But if it is clear, then the student should let go of it and move on because the implications will be discovered through using it. Michel also explained that it is also important that once something is understood, the student should not try to hold on to it. And the process of understanding has to be very, very clear for each individual. I don't want them to just have a general idea of understanding, of just to be nice and say yes, it is clear now. Again, it is very important just for the moment to be completely understood for that moment. By trying to hold on, the student is making a conscious effort and is trapped in the past. At the moment of first exposure, a student is not aware of all of the ramifications and uses. These are not to be figured out a priori. They will become apparent later in practice. Practice serves to fill in and connect up the unknowns. In printing. In short, the student doesn't have to worry about remembering something, but only to focus on understanding it, because Michel could come back to the moment and deepen it at any time. He referred to this aspect of his method as an imprint and explained it to us in this manner. It is the moment of what I call an imprint. The moment of understanding, of full understanding, is the moment of initial imprint. One doesn't try to hold on to it. I may at some point come back to it. They may or may not remember when I come back to it. If they don't remember it immediately, I will reinforce it and they will say aha, they will have the aha reaction, and they will have a deepening of the initial imprint. If they try to hold on to it, however, the imprint is gone. According to Michel, an imprint may be something very specific. It may be an idiomatic expression or the idiomatic use of something or an important vocabulary word. An imprint is not just a question of explaining. You see, explanations are not imprints, he went on to say. Therefore, if I give something which doesn't fit, then you say, how am I going to remember it? And the point is that you don't need to try to remember it. It is very important for you not to try to remember it. Michel added, trying to remember it and holding onto it is what I call throwing sand on the imprint. He continued to explain, personally, I find imprints interesting, what I call imprints, because of how the process works. There is something new, which is not a rule. Now how will they remember it, since they are not supposed to try to remember it? I will do something to help them to remember it, whether by an important vocabulary word or by idiom or whatever. But somehow, in different sentences and in different ways, at some point, not immediately, it will be used again. One of two things will happen. Either the student will remember it and have the aha reaction, or else the student may look for it and may not find it, in which case, that was fine according to Michel. He refined his explanation of imprints as follows, so I will come back to the imprint and it will be there again and I will deepen it. It is interesting to me that it works that way. If they remember it, they will have the aha reaction. The aha reaction means I am right, so I deepen it once and I may do it still another time. It will be there. Once I deepen it twice, it is there. It is also interesting to me because whenever one tries to remember, then it is gone. If Michel didn't get the aha reaction, he would know that the imprint was not there, and then he would have to create a new imprint. Michel found the concept of imprints rather intriguing because of what it revealed to him about the learning process of the human mind. All this is just interesting to me. To me, these are interesting discoveries about the mind. It needs to be stated explicitly that the master teacher instinctively knew the importance of memory. In fact, with his understanding of the memory puzzle and also in creating his method with its parts whole synergy, Michel was, in essence, a systems builder. What he said was that an understanding of the whole is more than simply memorizing its parts. An understanding of the whole allows the parts to fit together so that they make sense. Without this understanding, everything is an isolated piece, and it is simply too much work to chase after 1,000 pieces. Understanding creates an integrated whole, which then deepens into no edge. As we previously mentioned, there is another problem with trying to remember. Simply stated, trying to remember involves conscious effort, and this creates tension. The tension is there because there is always the effort to remember. Paradoxically, this tension makes it even harder to remember. Memory should be an effortless process. Michel early on discovered that in a state devoid of tension and anxiety, students had incredible memories for what he taught them. This was an amazing revelation 60 years ago. They recalled without either trying to remember or trying to recall. He was delighted to see that his students were able to recall without having to try to remember. This is a consequence of the natural process of reinforcement and of the connectivity of understanding. Once again, the master teacher revealed his genius. Why the distinction of knowledge based on understanding works in the Michel Thomas method. Why does Michel's method of no edge based on understanding work? As we have said, understanding is a process of connecting new information to what we already know so that it becomes no edge. It is essentially an integration process. When we are first exposed to new information, the first checks we make are to ask whether it makes sense, is it internally coherent, and also whether it corresponds to or contradicts what we already know. If it corresponds to what we already know, then we can connect it into our previous understanding. If it contradicts what we already know, then it calls for further examination. We are faced with two options. We can either reject it or we can readjust our previous understanding to include it. When we are first exposed to new information that makes sense and that is not incompatible with our previous understanding, we often unconsciously give it a provisional status. We will check it out to see if it holds up. We do this through practice. Also, all of the connections and implications of a new knowledge may not be clear at first. We accept the new information but it has yet to be integrated into our prior knowledge base. As we continue to use the new information, we make more and more connections, and it becomes more and more deeply integrated into what we know. Once assimilated, the new information becomes part of our knowledge. Once it is part of our knowledge, we will never forget it. The important point in our discussion is that the door to knowledge is through understanding and not through cramming and memorizing. As we stressed before, these activities neither produce understanding nor do they lead to long-term recall. As we will see in the next chapter, a major issue in education today is the conflict between the oldest educational systems trademark that enforce cramming and memorizing and the new systems that stress the critical importance of understanding and problem solving. The former leads to uniformity and mindless obedience, while the latter leads to critical thinking, which is absolutely necessary for democracy. It is vital that we now take charge in shifting from the ineffective, antiquated system to an entirely revamped educational system. As Michel would so often reiterate in the course of our modeling and in private conversation, critical thinking is essential to the survival of true democracy. No performance anxiety. One of the greatest sources of tension is the pressure to perform. Given the nature of our present driven to succeed in performance-based society, this type of tension is much more prevalent than ever and at younger ages. This is a tension that every student usually places upon himself or herself in the desire to succeed. In the traditional educational system, success and performance are notions that are incessantly being reinforced or triggered by both teachers and parents. Students are constantly told that they are responsible for their learning. The teacher is just there to help, but ultimately the students must do the work. They must work hard and study hard and be accountable. At some point, they will be tested on what they know. Moreover, to succeed in life you must work hard to get good grades, and having good grades means getting into college to prepare for a successful career. It is simply not acceptable to go through life ignorant and stupid. Ironically, that is precisely what Michel saw happening in today's world. Needless to say, all of this creates incredible pressure, anxiety, and tension in the learner. Michel realized that the final tension, which had to be released, is the tension of expectations. In order to deal with this, Michel did quite a remarkable thing, which we mention once again, this time in the context of performance. Remarkably, he took complete responsibility for the student's learning. The students are told that they are not to try to remember. It is simply not their responsibility. It was up to Michel to present the material in a way that the student would remember it. And if the student didn't remember, Michel would figure out why and make the necessary adjustments. Michael's problems. Eliminating mistakes is Michel's problem and not the student's. Responsibility for learning is Michel's problem and not the student's. Learning and remembering are Michel's responsibility. Don't try to take them away from him. Michel is at fault, never the student. Michel's doing this took tremendous pressure off of the student. We cannot overstate the fact that the responsibility for learning and remembering was up to Michel. If the students made a mistake, Michel would never correct it. Instead, he would recycle until the students thought it out and corrected it themselves. Michel would not directly correct his students, and instead he would teach the students how to correct for themselves. Since they had been taught how, the students would continue to think things through and correct themselves. This is an important point because once the students left the learning session, they didn't have a teacher around to correct their mistakes. To be successful, they needed to be able to think things through, to discover their own mistakes and to correct themselves. And this is precisely what Michel skillfully taught his students to do. Michel would do nothing at all to put pressure on the student. For Michel, pressure simply did not exist. He would never tense up or raise his voice, or reveal any annoyance to the student. He told us that he would never reveal annoyance, because he personally never experienced annoyance in the first place. The only thing that the student needed to do was to respond. If the students made a mistake, Michel would make no fuss about it. He would simply lead the students back to a similar situation so that they could go back and think it out and correct themselves. In short, Michel had two rules. First, was that the student was never at fault. Second, the corollary of rule 1 was that learning and remembering were Michel's responsibility. The student should let him do his job and never try to take it away from him. If the student didn't remember something, then it would be up to Michel to know why, and to figure out what to do about it. Students' problems none. These frames were designed to get the student to let go of all tension and performance anxiety they might experience. With no performance anxiety, the student would be free to just respond. In fact, learning in this way would end up creating immense excitement because Michel was triggering the powerful innate drive for learning that is in all living beings. Such concepts are unheard of in the traditional educational system. It is much easier on teachers to place the blame for lack of learning on their students. By washing their hands of all responsibility, teachers are freeing themselves of tension and placing it in their students. With Michel's system, the students felt no undue stress or anxiety in the context of learning. Because he put the responsibility of learning completely on his shoulders, he was literally able to remove every atom of tension, even if a person walked into his course already carrying some tension. With the fast-paced, soundbite society in which we live, most students arrived at his learning center breathing tension in every cell of their bodies. Michel would quickly and masterfully calibrate who was tense and why, and would then immediately wave his magic tension releasing wand to eliminate any stress and anxiety caused by external factors, not to mention the tension anchored in all who had had bad experiences in school, particularly in the context of language learning, which was the majority of people. There was another important byproduct of learning with the master teacher. Michel, in eliminating tension from his students, brought them an additional benefit, a gift of self-confidence as learners. Once students had gone through his course, they could control and monitor their own progress. They were able to go off on their own to speak, read, and write in the newly acquired target language. What he was doing was empowering his students to move ahead on their own. At the same time, he was instilling confidence within them in the context of their personal lives. By tapping into their immense learning potential, Michel was helping to guide them to an appreciation of life, to living a richer, fuller life and enhancing its overall quality. His teaching would often help them to remove tension in both their personal and professional lives. The students would go back to their lives with renewed confidence and not just in the context of learning. Michel's teaching literally opened the door to a new way of being as well. The annoyance factor not allowed. In the master teacher's presence, the students were never permitted to get annoyed themselves. Many students have been conditioned by parents and teachers to get irritated at themselves when they are not successful. There are some who may even hit themselves because they have been punished as children. As we have seen, conditioning creates a great deal of tension within the students, and tension is something that Michel did not permit under any circumstances. In fact, Michel would stop the students right away if he perceived the slightest bit of self-directed anger or frustration. He would then tell them that there was no room to get annoyed at themselves in his presence. Why? Because annoyance produces tension, and Michel would eliminate the tension so that learning could continue unimpeded. There is another twist regarding annoyance in Michel's learning environment. He would tell the students that it was fine for them to get annoyed, as long as they were getting annoyed at him, and not at themselves. If you have to get annoyed, then get annoyed at me, because I am doing it to you. You are not doing it to yourself. And I mean it. If you make a mistake, it is not your fault. It is up to me. If you miss something, if you want to get annoyed, it is perfectly alright. I accept it. Just get annoyed at me. Externalize your annoyance, but never get annoyed at yourself. It's like trying to drive a car while at the same time pushing on the accelerator and the brakes. It's not good for the car. It's not good for driving. You cannot do both at the same time. This made complete sense, and saying this would usually suffice to snap the student out of any tension-producing self-annoyance. There is another problem with expressing annoyance which the master teacher described this way. I will tell them that they are getting annoyed at themselves and that it is producing tension. He would tell the students that there was no reason for them to get annoyed. Furthermore, he would point out that it is very important to know that people who get easily annoyed at themselves while learning also easily get annoyed at themselves in many ways in other contexts of life. They place great expectations upon themselves, and they often punish themselves when they don't meet their own expectations in life. There is an inseparable connection between learning and life, which Michel observed over the years with one necessarily influencing the other. From our work as modelers and as trainers, we know that negative attitudes and emotional stances from life can have a detrimental effect on learning and on performance. Like annoyance, anything that gets in the way of learning is bad. Michel described the link between bad attitudes in life and learning as follows: that is interference with living. Anything that interferes with learning also interferes with what I call living. It's like trying to drive a car by pressing on the accelerator and the brake pedal at the same time. The same brakes that interfere with learning also interfere with living. If you remove what interferes with learning, you also remove what interferes with living. Michel preferred to see his students experience the joy and excitement of exceeding their own expectations, and he would always derive great personal joy from assisting them in the process. Michel learned another valuable lesson. Over the years, he had seen many students walk into the learning session with their individual problems, so he would tell them, if you want to get annoyed, fine, but externalize it. Get annoyed at me. And I mean it because I caused it. It is my responsibility, not yours. Never get annoyed at yourself. This was quite a revelation for his students. Michel went on to say, many had gone through their lives never realizing what they were doing to themselves, especially those who had problems. They say that now they are living. They are talking about my course saving their lives. Suddenly, they feel like they are living. They are experiencing something for the first time. They call it life-saving. I don't say that to turn myself into a lifesaver. I want only to show the close connection between learning and life. Allow people to learn properly and you open up the doors to living, the same doors. For the master teacher, removing the annoyance factor from his students' shoulders created great excitement and served to enhance the learning process by triggering one's innate drive for learning.